Hello, everyone. In today's lecture, we are going to be wrapping up this Java series. So if you have been here as long as this series has been, so you watch all of these videos, being lectures and coding tutorials, then you have basically got the basics of Java programming. Now, I'm keeping that real lightly on basic, meaning you should be able to create a Java program well enough to do some sort of application or some computation program, whatever the case may be. But basically, my goal was to show you everything bare minimum that you need to know in Java to create great programs. So we have finally reached the end. And today we are going to be wrapping up with the topics of working with files in Java. So let's get into file I/O. So file I/O matters because as you work with programs, you're going to need to start working with data. And when you're working with data, there will be times where you need to save and or load data into your program to do some sort of action. So file I/O, what is it? Basically, the I and the O stand for input and output, meaning input as in you're reading from a file and output meaning you're writing to a file. Now, both of these input and output are going to use classes that can be found in your built-in Java classes or packages, java.io and java.util. Now, we're going to discuss the file class. So this is a built-in Java class that you can import that will allow you to work with a file or directory on your computer. So when you're using this file class, and we're going to think of this similar to how you use a scanner, except you're using a file in this case, basically you will represent a file or directory path with a file object. So this is going to tell Java where that file is. So in the example you see here, the first word we have is file, basically creating a file object called F that is going to hold a new file called data.txt. So when you're working with your file objects, here's what they do. Basically, the file object is going to store the file name and the path, and that file object is going to let you check things like existence and size or other file methods. Now, what it won't let you do is it won't let you read or write data in that file, and it also will not let you open the file. So the file object is pretty much useful for storing that file name and path and letting you use some file methods on it. Now those file methods we have here on the screen. So we have .exist, .ling, .getName, .getAbsolutePath, .isDirectory, and .isFile. All of these will allow you to get some information about the file. Now, the most common ones you'll probably be using in this case is .exist and .ling, because you may want to see first if the file that you're trying to work with actually exists or can be found, or you may want to see how much size is associated with that file. So that will be .ling. The other ones are used in need to have basis, but basically the top two are going to be the most common ones you will probably want to use or need to use in your code. Now, let's look at a file method example. So once you have your file object created, in this case ours is still called F, then basically we have an if statement here that's checking if f exists. And if it does, then it's basically printing out two statements. The first is printing out file found. The second is printing out the actual size of the link. So in this case, this file example is using .exists and .length. First, checking if the file exists. Second, showing the file size to the user using .length. So those file methods I just mentioned are not used for reading and writing. They're simply just giving you details about the file that you're working with. Now, there are tools that exist that will allow you to work with your files, whether it be input or output. And to do this, you would use some other built-in Java classes to work with those files. Now, one we've already worked with before, which is the scanner. And the next one is going to be PrintWriter, which is used to write to a file. So to connect all of these topics together, a file is going to be associated with the address of the file. And then the scanner or the PrintWriter is going to allow you to use a tool on that address. So now that we've pretty much covered what you can do, let's get into how we are going to read files in Java. Now first, when you're reading your file, we're working with a scanner object. So the very first thing you would have to do in this case is first create your file object. Once that's done, you need to connect that file object to a scanner. So in this case, we're pretty much creating the file object new file data.txt. And it's connected to a scanner, which we have named SC. Once you have a scanner connected, you pretty much can read the file line by line, and after you do that, you would close the scanner. So this will make more sense in a code example. But when you are reading files, you may run into some errors. And you know, in our last lecture, we discussed having errors. In this case, you could try to run a program that tries to read a file, but either that file doesn't exist, maybe your file path is wrong, or you don't have file permissions to work with that file. So to overcome this issue, this is where your exceptions and your error handling, which we just learned, is going to come into play. Now, the main thing you're going to deal with when you're working with files, or the main exception, I should say, is going to be the file not found exception. And this is basically stating it can't find the file. So either the file doesn't exist, it's in the wrong location or folder, you misspelled it, or you just simply can't access it. So these are some things that may cause a file not found exception. Now, as we previously mentioned in our last lecture, when you're dealing with exceptions, you must use a try catch because this is going to protect your program from those unpredictable file errors that you may come across. So in this case, the try block will contain your attempt to opening the file. The catch will contain the information needed if something were to go wrong with opening that file. So now that we covered all that information, we're going to take a look at printing the contents of a file. So if we have a file and we wanted to see what was in the file and print it to our console, this is the code we could use. In this case, we have our try block, which is pretty much creating a file object. It's then connecting that file object to a scanner, and then that can be seen with the red arrows. So you see the red arrow for pointing to the F. then you can see how we are connecting that file object of F to our scanner with the red arrows. Our blue arrows are showing you how our scanner is being used inside of our try block. So we're basically saying while the scanner has the next line, basically saying your scanner is going to go line by line. It's going to assign that line to a variable called line, and it's going to print it out. And it will continue to do this as long as that scanner object has another line that it can access. Now, when it runs out of lines, pretty much this loop will stop and your scanner will close. That is the code that we see in our try block. Now, in our catch block, we have our file not found exception. And this is going to happen if, for whatever reason, that your program cannot find that data.txt file or .text file. So if it can't find that data.txt file, it will then print to you that the file is not found instead of immediately crashing your program code. So this is how error handling and file I/O work together. So basically, your try catch is going to be required because Java is always going to need a backup plan when you're working with files, because you never know if the file is in the right spot or if it even exists. So the overall process of what kind of happens in the file I/O stage. So first you have your try block. Your Java program or IDE is going to attempt to complete this action, whatever's in your try block. So if that try block is successful, the program's going to run normally. Now, in the case that it is not successful, the catch block will then run, and it's basically only going to run if whatever's in that try block fails. And it's pretty much just completing what we went over in our last lecture, which is error handling. So now that we've covered how to read files, we're also going to cover writing files. So to write a file, we're going to use something called PrintWriter. Similar to Scanner, but in this case, it's actually going to write text or print. So in this case, the first thing you do is create that PrintWriter object. In this case, or this example, we have it named as out, and we're basically saying it's going to have the output.txt file associated with it. So it's going to write text. And once you write text, you're pretty much just going to close the writer. So you're going to create a PrintWriter, you're going to write your text, and then as soon as you're done, you're going to close that writer out. So here we have some example code for that in our try block. The first line you see in our try block is our PrintWriter object named out, which you can see with the red arrow. And in this case, out is going to say the PrintWriter is going to write output.txt. And it's basically saying we're going to write whatever is under this PrintWriter object. In this case, we have two print statements, hello file and writing to easy. Now you see when we're printing, we're saying out.println. Out is referring to our PrintWriter object. So we're saying out.println hello file, which is basically going to print that into our output.txt, and the same for the next line. Once our lines are written, we close the file. Now, again, never know what can happen, so we have our catch block that is pretty much going to say if for whatever reason that this file cannot be found, then this is what we want to print out to the user. Again, when working with files, you always want to make sure you have a try and catch to prevent any runtime issues. Now that we have covered your reading and your writing, there's also the file writer class that we have been covering. So in this one, we have PrintWriter. In this one, we have file writer. Okay, two separate things. So your file writer is going to be used to write characters to a file. So in this case, we are writing some text to a file using the PrintWriter. In this case, we will be adding or overwriting a file. So in this case, if you use this, it can create the file if it doesn't exist, or it can overwrite or add append to a file. So appending basically means that you're going to be adding some new text to the end of an existing file. So let's say you already have some data in the file and you just want to add a little bit more information to it. Then this one would come in handy, file writer, instead of a print writer. Now, could you technically use the print writer? Yes, it does write to a file. However, it can potentially wipe out the contents of that file, so it doesn't necessarily add information, it just replaces the information. So in this case, this file writer will allow you to add new text to the end of an existing file. Now, here is an example of that where we say file writer, we give it a name, and then we say new file writer with the actual text file name. Now, the one thing you need to note is that there is a second argument when using the file writer, and that is going to be true. So pretty much in this statement, the two things that could change in our example here is the object name. FW can be whatever you need it to be, and that data file can be whatever file you want to name your data file. But everything else should pretty much remain the same, including the true. Now, here's an example of actually using that file writer and the print writer at the same time. So what's going on is you see that we are using our file writer object in our print writer object. You can see this with the red arrows. So you see that our print writer is taking in an argument of FW, which is our file writer object. And basically what we're doing is we're saying that we are going to write out to this file that we have, which is log.txt. We are going to add the line of code that says new line added to the file, and then we're going to close out that print writer. Again, in this case, we do have our catch block, and it is doing a IO exception, so input output exception, and it's basically saying that we could not write to this file if there are any issues. So in a sense, when you're appending to a file, you are still using one of those two main tools that I spoke about earlier, which is scanner and your print writer, except we're using a file writer to work along with the print writer. But without the print writer, the file writer would not necessarily work properly. So they do technically and typically go hand in hand if they are used. So the key takeaways here is that your scanner is going to be used for your input to read your files. The print writer is going to be for output to write to your files, and your file writer is going to be to append or add to your files. Now, regardless of which one you use, all of them are going to use and implement a try-catch block. So it is important that you definitely get all of the topics we covered in our error handling in your head when you're using files, because you are most likely going to run into some problems when you're first getting started with them. All right, so we have finally made it to the end of this last lecture. So today we covered your file class and the methods that go with it, I mean, as well as your reading, writing, and appending to your files. So now that you know how to work with files in Java, you can save any data you're working with in your program to be reused and or stored for other purposes. And this is going to come in handy when you're creating some sophisticated or unique Java applications. So basically, in this series, we have covered a lot of information. There were a lot of videos, there were a lot of hours put into this, but overall, I have taught you everything you need to know, bare minimum, to get started in learning in Java and to progress and to eventually become an advanced coder in this language. Of course, it's going to take more than just my Java series for you to understand the content, but I wanted to take the approach of first showing you a common everyday lecture and then following it up by the coding tutorials. So yes, we are wrapping up the lecture portion of our series, but we technically have one more coding tutorial to go to close us out. So I look forward to seeing you in that next video to close us out.